Good morning, Namaskar. Honorable Vice Chancellor Dr. Shantashri Dolapudi Pandit, Dean of the SIS, Head of CPOD Dr. Amitabh Mattu, respected former faculty and present faculty, Professor Muni, guests who have joined us today. Some of them have traveled from afar to come here, and dear students of this wonderful university. To be back after many years to this center, to deliver and to be asked to deliver the first Professor Matinu-Zaman Zuberi lecture is indeed an honor. It is doubly so that it is in the presence of the Honorable Vice Chancellor, who is perhaps amongst the most distinguished alumni of this school and of this center. To the Vice Chancellor, I want to express my gratitude for chairing this meeting. To Dr. Amitabh Mattu, the chair of Seaport Center and one of the foremost IR scholars in the country. This memorial lecture is yet another instance of his dynamism that he has imparted to all the assignments that he has held here in India and abroad. And working for a good supervisor, I think, is one of the best investments you can make, not just intellectually, but in forging bonds of friendship that that last a lifetime. It is a pleasure that Irfan Zuberi, Professor Zuberi's son, has joined us today. By the time I joined the university in 1982, Professor Zuberi was already a well-known public intellectual. For his academic distinction in studying issues of war and peace, which incidentally was the title of one of the courses he took for MA students. He began his teaching career at the Aligarh Muslim University and moved to JNU in 1975, where he taught for over 2 decades. A globalist, he had studied at Oxford and was widely traveled, but he was foremost an Indian nationalist who believed deeply that the pursuit of excellence in any field must serve the interests of the motherland. Thus, the natural interface he saw between academic excellence, which he embodied, and policy relevance that he aspired to. Of course, never one to take self-promotion too seriously. An euphemism he often mentioned was the Kissinger syndrome about academics and diplomats, by which he meant, referring to the larger-than-life profile of Henry Kissinger, that many academics harbor the secret desire to have his policy impact, and many diplomats who not so secretly seek to embellish their image with the veneer of Kissinger's academic brilliance. The syndrome will outlive the man whose passing we marked last week. Professor Zuberi had a sharp mind, an open heart, and a gentle soul. And entering his class was like being drawn into another world. Enticing as it was fascinating, but an entrapment it was. As his fellow traveler on a journey of study and discourse, on matters of war and peace. Those of us who those of us who had the good fortune of taking the plunge would remember his narration of Tolstoy's War and Peace, of Prince Andrei lying wounded on the battlefield at Borodino, looking at the stars, reflecting on the meaning of life in a future that awaited him as Napoleon's prisoner of war. Why the best book written by Paul Kennedy is not the better known Rise and Fall of Great Powers, but his earlier book on British naval mastery. Stalin's discovery of General Zhukov after the Battle of Khalkhin Gol against the Japanese in Manchuria in 1939. French and American military power after the fall of Dien Bien Phu in 1954 and the fall of Saigon in 1975. Now, what was the middle name of the US president who dropped the two atomic bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki? Harry S. Truman. Why was Niels Bohr considered a great nuclear physicist, but a big bore? The spiritual universe of Robert Oppenheimer, in which the Bhagavad Gita figured prominently. Homi Bhabha, the father of the Indian nuclear program. His imprints on India's scientific capabilities to the design of the tables and chairs in the Bach cafeteria. The genius of Field Marshal Manik Shaw, who led the Indian Army in 1971 in the most successful military intervention since 1945. The intricacies of nuclear deterrence and the meaning of deterrence in an age of revolutionary armies. Why not signing the NPT in 1967, the road not taken, was perhaps independent India's most consequential of national security decisions. And national security thinking for India outside the Anglo-Saxon bubble, which was and sadly remains the dominant analytical framework of our times. Like Mr. K. Subramaniam, the foremost of our strategic thinkers, Professor Zuberi and many of his generation strongly believed in Indianizing the strategic prism through which we view the world. It is, after all, in the mind that strategic autonomy begins its life journey, and it is in the mind that it must be first nurtured. Professor Zuberi supervised my MPhil thesis. It was a comparative study of diplomacy and strategy of India's conduct of the 1971 and 1965-1971 wars with Pakistan. This was part of his pet project of documenting India's wars since independence. His style was to inspire deep reading and reflection, and not compel prejudged conclusions on his students. The joy was in the journey of looking for new facts through new perspectives, but all tied together to answer a single question. What does it mean for India and its interests in global affairs? Like ticketless passengers on buses avoid ticket collectors, research students generally avoid their supervisors when thesis submissions are long overdue. On one such occasion, I ran into Professor Zuberi in the up-campus bookshop. And on being asked when I would turn in the full draft, Professor Zuberi preferred to see the draft in full and not chapter-wise. I said it was almost done, as only the concluding chapter was left to be written. A week went by, then 2, and then 3. Thank you. This time, the unplanned, much feared encounter was during his evening walk, as Dr. Mattu mentioned, along the ring road behind Dakshinapuram. Since he was a brisk walker, a quick escape was ruled out. So, are you writing another 40 pages for a conclusion? He asked. No, sir, the conclusion is not 40 pages, but just 4 paragraphs. Ah, no wonder. The shorter it is, the longer it takes. It better be good. I don't think he was disappointed with the final product. My enduring disappointment, however, which will remain a mark of the incomplete list of my own life, is that I didn't get to complete the PhD thesis under his supervision. On one of his visits abroad, Professor Zuberi picked up two copies of Makers of Modern Strategy. One of which he gifted to me. Edited by Peter Parrott, and this volume sets out the key markers of modern strategic thought from Machiavelli to the nuclear age. This 1986 edition was an update on the first volume published in 1943. The third and latest volume, released just a few months ago, called The New Makers of Modern Strategy, edited by Hal Brands, is a must-read. Unfortunately, it does not include a chapter on Kautilya, a question I will return to later in my talk. In our daily lives, we all understand strategy broadly as getting things done. In the life of countries, however, matters of state, so to speak, strategy is more complex. National objectives differ, the means to achieve them are dissimilar, and the international environment is often contested. The ever-present specter of use or threat of use of military force, which is the central characteristic that sets apart the purposes of strategy, in fact sets apart the discipline as a whole. While strategic instruments are impersonal, strategic decisions are not. These are made by individuals in positions of leadership that affect the fate of millions. For there is no human enterprise more consequential than the macabre dance of death and destruction on the highway of war. No war is good if it is avoidable, but lost wars are dreadful, for they inflict on the defeated not just the destruction wrought by battle, but also the harsh penalties of peace that arise from defeat. Good tactics enable good strategy, but successful strategy is one that fulfills the objectives of policy and remains bound by its limitations. In the pitiless world of strategy, high ambition, backed by low capability, is a sin without salvation. Grand strategy, one of the pillars of statecraft, which readers of Kautilya would be familiar with, considers not just military but non-military means. Grand strategy determines not only how to fight wars but when to fight them. For there are times when it is more prudent to undertake peacetime competition rather than seek military conflict. Grand strategy is the key to keeping a balance between means and ends. When to end a war is often as critical as when to start one. In the history of nations, in the history of great powers are those who have good grand strategies. In the summer of 1979, Michael Hart, Oxford University's foremost war historian, wrote a seminal article in Foreign Affairs entitled Forgotten Dimensions of Strategy, in which, after a majestic survey of war in the preceding 3 centuries, identified 4 dimensions along which wars are conducted: the operational, the logistical, the social, and the technological, pointing out that under different circumstances, one or another of these dimensions would dominate and determine war outcomes. Professor Howard was writing at the height of the Cold War, when a relatively steady geopolitical balance acted as a stable foundation for the operationalization of nuclear deterrence and its associated ecosystem of arms control and non-proliferation amongst the big powers. The purpose of that article was to warn against the dangers of excessive dependence on the technological dimensions of war, in particular nuclear war, to the exclusion of the other 3. Were Michael Hart to write that article again today, I would expect that he would add a 5th dimension, which is geopolitics. The renewed geopolitical competition between the big powers and the consequent weakening and fragmentation of deterrence and relations amongst them which has led to the current lawlessness in the international system. This is where we turn to the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The Russia-Ukraine war is fundamentally a failure of big power deterrence on account of miscalculations on both sides, on questions of capability, credibility, and communication on part of both Russia and the United States. The active phase of the Russia-Ukraine conflict is now well into its second year. Since 2014, when an insurrection in Kyiv unseated the incumbent president, relations between the two were tense, but subsequent opportunities for a peaceful resolution receded as Ukraine swung decisively to the west. War was not inevitable, but opportunities for peace were lost by both sides. The 2015 Minsk Accords, the first year of President Zelensky's term, the Biden-Putin Geneva Summit of June 2021, Russian proposals on European security of December 21, and the abortive Russia-Ukraine peace talks of March and April 2022, which we now know from Ukrainian leaders were taken on the advice of the United Kingdom and the United States. That Russia had to resort to use of force in its neighborhood is not a measure of successful deterrence. That Ukraine miscalculated that its campaign to join NATO would not cross a red line that Russia had repeatedly articulated since 2007 is not a measure of successful counter-deterrence. Ukraine took the risk of seeking the protection of a distant power to address its proximate security needs. The deeply embedded perception of Russian weakness, evident since the 1990s on part of the United States and its NATO allies, masked from view the turnaround in Russian military strength under President Putin and its will to act militarily to protect its interests in Ukraine. This is now a proxy war between Russia and the West. While the military conflict has been confined to Ukraine, southern Russia to a little bit, and the Black Sea area, the economic, energy, informational, and cyber dimensions have given it a global scale. Like all proxies, the fate of Ukraine is no longer in its hands, but at the mercy of wavering American strategic benevolence and uncertain European support. There have been proxies in the past, and there will be more in the future. But they all meet the same fate. For in geopolitical conflict involving the big powers, proxies are the doormats of history. While I have written elsewhere about the Ukraine conflict, and I'm a bit embarrassed to say that on the first day of the war itself, on 24th February 2022, and with a subsequent piece on 24th February 2023, both in the Indian Express, which laid out a broken future for Ukraine with partial but permanent loss of territory to Russia, and with the rump Ukraine joining NATO. Perhaps I'm getting a bit ahead of myself. Let me return to the 5 dimensions of strategy that we just referred to. In operational terms, Russia's desire for a quick and decisive blow against Kyiv in the early months of the war was a stunning failure. The fighting ability of the Ukrainian units, trained to NATO standards since 2016, compelled Russian withdrawals in northern and northeastern Ukraine. The societal dimension also held up, though over 10 million people, Ukrainian people, fled as refugees to Europe and to Russia. President Zelensky was able to rally his country, undertake successive mobilizations, and conduct successful operations until September 2022, when Ukrainian forces reached the peak of their fighting capacity, having made advances in Kherson, Kharkiv, and Sumy areas. Military support from the United States and NATO advanced weaponry added an advanced technological dimension to its military fighting capacity, even to the extent of hitting targets in southern Russia. By the winter of 2022, the war had settled into a stalemate as none of the 5 dimensions of strategy, operational, logistical, technological, social, societal, or geopolitical, were able to provide a decisive outcome to one side or the other. Russia was too weak to win, and Ukraine was too strong to lose. But in war, as in life, time does not stand still. In the second year, the stalemated war has turned gradually in Russia's favor. US and EU sanctions against Russia were predicated on crippling Russia's ability and will to conduct a prolonged war. Contrary to Western expectations, the Russian defense industry has bounced back with huge hike in defense expenditure and conditions for better than expected but still modest economic growth. The Russian military, like in all wars, is proven to be adept at learning from its past mistakes. Having blunted the fighting capacity of the virulently far-right anti-Russian units in the Ukrainian armed forces, including the Azov battalion in Mariupol, Russia has systematically reduced Ukrainian fighting power in battles around Bakhmut and now in Avdiivka. Like a coconut grater, strong Russian defenses have decimated Ukrainian forces. In operational terms, the war has moved from one of maneuver to one of attrition. This is due to the impact of the ISR revolution, which is intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance revolution, disrobing battlefields of stealth or cover, and the proliferation of drones and standoff weapons, which can hit at will forces out in the open, making offensive operations costly in terms of equipment and manpower. Ukraine is also running short of fighting manpower, with its average officer age in the high 40s. With an operational stalemate compounded by societal and logistical weakness, Ukraine is now desperately searching for a technological edge that could restore balance on the battlefield, which it can get only from the West, which is, of course, linked to the geopolitical dimension of the war. While President Putin's nuclear warnings to the West not to supply advanced weaponry to Ukraine went largely unheeded, the West is now worried about the consequences of a major escalation with Russia. A Ukraine fatigue has set in Europe, prompted also by the hugely negative impact of sanctions on Russian energy supplies. In America, the political ground has shifted with a Republican pushback in an election year that is coming up. American focus towards Israel following the crisis in Palestine since early October has struck a bloody blow to Ukraine as the top spot for American attention. Thus, with the logistical and geopolitical dimensions of the war shifting in its favor, perhaps irreversibly, Russia may be better placed by next year to dictate the terms of a peace settlement that it has been since the commencement of the war in February 2022. It will, of course, be a contested peace, with the US and EU continuing with the tight sanctions regime as well as the geopolitical encirclement of Russia on its periphery. But having prevailed militarily, Russia would dictate terms for peace whose primary aim would be to ensure that Ukraine would not relaunch a war of revanchism to take back Donbass or become a forward base for American or NATO forces. Ukraine is learning the hard way the risks of entrusting national security to the fickle affections of geopolitical mentors. India's diplomatic approach to the Russia-Ukraine war has been one of pragmatic prudence, even while recognizing the unpredictable nature of war gains in an interconnected world, with Prime Minister Modi saying that it was not an era of war. Our diplomacy achieved the difficult task of bringing back over 20,000 Indian students from Ukraine, many of them from active war zones. While India has not condemned Russia for the invasion, it has highlighted the broader consequences of the war on energy, food, fertilizers, and the global disequilibrium that the war has produced. Russia, a long-standing strategic partner, may finally prevail in Ukraine, but the war has placed it on the back foot for at least the next decade. The US, another of our close strategic partners, is now an extended global power. attempting dual containment of Russia and China, and succeeding in neither. This has provided a geopolitical sweet spot for Russia, for China, which it is poised to exploit despite the considerable downturn in its economic growth and instability in the ranks of its governing elite, including in the military. What then are the takeaways for India? While Indian diplomacy has shown considerable skill in navigating a turbulent international system, including the extraordinary success of the G20 summit that India hosted in September of this year, the underlying geopolitical trends are, of course, deeply troubling. A breakdown in deterrence equations, with nuclear deterrence no longer capable of deterring big power conflict in the conventional, cyber, or space domains, and the weaponization of global interdependence, radiating instability and unpredictability into non-military sectors globally. International law, public opinion, the United Nations, or even public conscience are no longer adequate filters against conflict. There is willful disregard of the UN and of arms control and disarmament agreements. In this age of lawlessness, old paradigms of deterrence are breaking down under the weight of new actors and new technologies and new threats. So, what specific lessons can India take from the Russia Ukraine conflict and the broader international situation? Operationally, the Ukraine conflict portends the onset of prolonged wars, which count not on military defeat but national exhaustion of the enemy. While no two wars are alike, and our security environment with China and Pakistan is vastly different, for India, the paradigm shift in warfare will impact on our own planning for the future. With the ascendancy of defense as compared to offense and the elimination of surprise due to the ISR revolution, semi-war preparedness would become the norm. This would require longer deployments and quicker rotations than in the past. The possibility of a two-front war with both Pakistan and China is higher than in the past, requiring India to prepare two different warfighting doctrines, but for their simultaneous execution. Prolonged wars also require logistics, stocks, reserves, and industry manufacturing potential of a higher order, as well as insulation against uncertainty of external supplies. Societal changes should also adapt to the new strategic requirements, higher education standards for intake into our armed forces, and an in-service retention pattern that will ensure sufficiently trained and experienced units that can maintain effective combat readiness for prolonged periods in a high-tech combat environment. This is not easy for countries moving from limitless peasantry to a middle-class aspiring youth in a fast-growing economy. In terms of technology, we're witnessing the dawn of multi-domain combat environments with unpredictable cross-domain linkages, cyberspace, and artificial intelligence, which are fundamentally transformative of future warfare. The fusion between sensor and striker and weapon systems will become tighter and faster than ever before. Technology is malleable, thus making situational and doctrinal supplies likely. If we make the mistake of thinking that our opponent thinks like us. Therefore, prepare to be surprised, but prepare to prevail. The geopolitical dimension is now a critical reference point to calculate accurately the ebb and flow of international power. The role of diplomacy is vital as the eyes and ears on a fast-changing world. It is also the first line of risk and opportunity assessment. Developing our own concepts is necessary as part of the change that we are witnessing. Just as we cannot build multipolarity concepts that serve the unipolar world, is like thinking that we can make dosa batter with pizza dough. Diplomacy can also play the role of facilitation of access to sinews of our national development, to capital markets, technology, and the protection of our nationals in foreign countries. While we are focused on maritime connectivity, India's continental access to mainland Eurasia is being challenged by the extension of Chinese influence into Central Asia, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. How can India become a great power if we are geopolitically marginalized on our own mother continent? Hence the importance of the international North-South corridor, the Eastern Maritime Corridor, and the recently launched India-Middle East Corridor. Balancing our continental interests with those that of our maritime interests is thus vitally important. Geopolitical conflict feeds not just on territories but also on technology. Given the pervasive securitization of global interdependence and the fact that global supply chains constitute more than 70% of global trade, it is vital that we have the best of relations with the United States and the top technology companies, which are now formidable global players in their own right. As a global power, the US would seek trade-offs consistent with its own global interests. Its current strategic predicament, a failing dual containment strategy against Russia and China, along with a highly volatile Middle East involving the security of Israel, is stretching US global influence to its limits. In the words of one of its distinguished defense secretaries, the US is now a dysfunctional superpower, but it is gaining and regaining influence elsewhere in East Asia, Latin America, and including in South Asia. For India, it is important to deal with the US for what it is: the world's largest economy, a preeminent technology and energy power, but whose power projection capabilities are increasingly constrained by domestic factors. A deeply divided domestic polity, eroding its ability to simultaneously pursue a welfare state at home and a warfare state abroad, driving an unsustainable rise in national debt. The US of the coming decades will be very different from the US we have known since the end of the Cold War. Exaggerated notions of US omnipotence in global affairs that tend to sometimes color our thinking, much like the notions that were unquestioningly held about Soviet omnipotence in the 1980s. This campus is all too familiar with that for sure, can only set the stage for mutual disappointment. Diplomacy can also play the role of a compensator or force multiplier. In situations of power asymmetry that we now face with China. Last year, China's total global exports were the same as India's GDP. China will be a formidable power in the coming decades and is showing the same proclivities for domination as hegemonic powers of the past. We should see China through our own prism, not one borrowed from others. Restoring credible military deterrence with China will enhance our ability to break the girdle that it seeks to build in our immediate neighborhood. While our neighborhood policy should be one of maximum possible economic accommodation, our headlines of no foreign military presence or bases on their soil should be clearly understood by our neighbors. The Ukraine case shows that such attempts only bring grief to all concerned. Similarly, we need a new naval framework and capabilities to retain predominance in the Indian Ocean region. While friendly navies are welcome, a free and open Indo-Pacific does not mean that the Indian Ocean is a free-for-all Dharamshala. Our defense relations with the US and arrangements such as the Quad are useful and necessary balancing instruments to compensate for the power differentials, but such mechanisms can only be supplementary in nature and cannot wholly compensate for shortfalls in our economic and defense potentials. There is no substitute for robust build-up of our own economic and military capabilities, and those supporting the so-called external balancing strategy to fill these gaps only generate false hopes and expectations. Here too, Ukraine is a tragic example of the fate that awaits those willing to become proxies in big power conflicts. Living on borrowed money is not the same as living on borrowed military strength. It erodes sovereignty and strategic autonomy more quickly. With the US, our bilateral defense cooperation should increase robust technological cooperation, for which the ISET offers a promising start, and coordination of our deterrence postures in the broader region, with the US embracing the objective of a strong and independent India as vital to its own strategic interests. The US would naturally seek a trade-off for such cooperation in terms of India committing to an alignment with its regional global interests. On some issues, these coincide. On some, they don't. Extracting sustained US support for India's interests under conditions of increased and fluctuating demands on US resources for its interests elsewhere will be a vexing and perhaps exhausting preoccupation for our diplomacy. But we should make every effort. The sustainability of our long-term relations with the US is not only a matter of convergence of interests on specific issues, but equally of understanding of their limits on both sides and an agreement on both sides that these limits will be respected. Strong fences make good neighbors, but also strong partnerships. A friction reduction instrument at the heart of the Indo-US strategic partnership will therefore be of invaluable importance. Ukraine is an example of the thin line between partner and proxy, and a lesson for any country wanting to become the Ukraine of the Indo-Pacific. To clarify matters, the US should embrace our strategic autonomy, just as it accepted India's independent nuclear deterrence as a positive factor for our own interests. In practice, this would mean drawing a red line on the issue of integration of our defense forces with those of the US, either through interoperability or joint basing. External aid is important we engage but not get entangled in its global interests, which are varied and liable to unilateral change. In short, for our relations with the United States, coordination yes, integration no, engagement yes, entanglement no. Within these parameters, there exists a vast universe of cooperation possibilities which are vital and necessary for India's security, which may be pursued with full vigor. For there is no other relationship that is more important for India to get right than that with the United States. Russia will remain important for the coming decades for our defense inventory management, alternative energy sources, and for balance on the Eurasian continent. Russia of the future will be very different from the Russia of the past. Despite its current weakness, Russia is a permanent and valuable partner on the Eurasian continent, even though its perceived weakness will continue to invite US pinpricks in the coming decade. But if the United States, the world's most powerful maritime power, places a low premium on stability on the Eurasian continent, India cannot remain insulated from its destabilizing impact for long. If the net result of US policy on the Eurasian continent is a steady expansion of Chinese influence, even while India is expected to join the United States in containing China in the maritime domain, the resulting incongruity at the heart of India's grand strategy cannot be ignored for long. The next decade will be more challenging than the last one. Diplomacy is important, but there is no substitute. But there is no substitute for national strength and capabilities. The next 25 years, what our Prime Minister calls the Amrit Kal, is vital for our economic growth and sustaining high growth figures, ensuring equity and innovation, and doubling our GDP every decade, aiming for $30 trillion GDP by 2047 when we celebrate the 100 years of our independence. This by itself will be the highest national security requirement. In the last few years, India has put in place the transformative macroeconomic prerequisites ranging from GST, infrastructure, domestic manufacturing, a world-class digital public infrastructure, which is absolutely one of the great achievements of India, startups to name a few. However, in the field of computing technology, which is the defining technology of this century, like nuclear technology was the yardstick of power last century, where there are only two distinct artificial intelligence superpowers, which are US and China. India has a lot of catching up to do. While the government has already initiated steps to on our semiconductor technologies, we have a long way to go. We can and we should be the front face of the front end of the fourth industrial revolution, not its back end and its back office. While the government has taken steps, I think this is a national priority that we need to take forward. Overall, if we can maintain the tempo of reform and innovation under conditions of political and domestic stability, there is widespread expectation that incredible India will also be, as some have said, an inevitable India in terms of joining the ranks of the great powers. India is undergoing a quiet military revolution, with the government determined to take forward defense reforms in a fundamental way. Changes in command and control, with emphasis on jointness, integration, and theaterization, will greatly enhance the combat capabilities of our armed forces. Changes in recruitment procedures through the Agniveer program and the indigenization of procurement and manufacture of weapon systems, greater participation of the private sector, and emphasis on defense exports put together will fundamentally transform our armed forces. However, the most important change will be in doctrine, considering not only changes in our immediate security environment, but also global trends which have been referred to earlier. To support these changes, it is necessary to increase defense spending to an average of 3% of GDP enshrined in law for the next decade. This will provide predictable resource base to plan this build-up. While conflict with China is not inevitable, a continuing military gap could only increase its probability. Before I conclude, let me turn briefly on the status of strategic studies in India. As part of globalization, it was understandable that our security community absorbed strategic perspectives largely influenced by concepts and frameworks of the West. This trend was further reinforced by the huge improvement in relations with the United States during the last 2 decades. Our expectations of a permanently benign global situation have obviously been belied. This reversal, disappointing as it is, has also led to a creeping self-doubt on whether we can afford to pursue a policy of strategic autonomy, largely due to the spectacular rise of China. The belief that the erosion of strategic autonomy is a justifiable cost to be paid for its preservation is fundamentally flawed, and it is a barrier to India's rise. Our strategic autonomy is both a practical strategic requirement and a civilizational necessity. We have much to be proud of. Kautilya's Arthashastra is not just a political treatise, not just a textbook on statecraft. It is a magnum opus in grand strategy, more comprehensive than the works of Machiavelli, Jomini, Clausewitz, or other thinkers. Though written millennia ago, its timeless quality is derived from the grammar and logic that Kautilya's distilled wisdom provides for strategy's permanent dilemmas. How to pursue long-term goals with constantly shifting balance of power among competing states under material limitations and mental distractions. Kautilya's prescriptions are for those who want India to transition from power to great power, not for those willing to let India slip from partner to proxy. In Kautilya's world, strategic autonomy is non-negotiable. It is the original purpose for which the state exists. Kautilya is required for nurturing of the mind and also strengthening of the soul. The Arthashastra is a grammar of strategy for the ages, with each epoch, with each age, writing its own strategic literature. With such a rich tradition to draw on, we should have no difficulty to construct our own strategic thought and practice for India's needs relevant to our own times. This will entail restoring confidence in ourselves and a clear vision of what we are and what we aspire to be. In other words, to transition from an allotted identity given to us by others to an identity rooted in our own land and ethos. In the world of strategy, what nations accomplish is determined by what they settle for as much as what they aspire to. For India, we owe it to our sacred land the higher purpose, passion and perseverance that is bequeathed by our civilization. A vision of India's greatness that is backed by a moral conviction that provides all our people hope and a sense of belonging, which soothes the pain of sacrifice our country's rise will invariably require. It is to that higher calling that we must all strive for in this university and beyond. Thank you.